There was a blue moon last night, which means it's time for my every blue moon table saw tune-up.
For the safety police that are going to be watching this, I am going to be unplugging my saw. And a little bit about my saw. I have the Craftsman 21-833 10-inch contractor saw. It's pretty much the exact same thing as the rigid version. This one just happens to have red paint. So the first thing I'm going to do is clean my blade because it's been a minute. I've got to be honest with you, this blade just lives in my saw. I know other woodworkers use different blades for different applications, but I'm really not that good of a woodworker. And this is a flat grind blade, so I can use it for pretty much everything. Now to clean the blade, I'm going to be using Rockler's pitch and resin remover. I've had this jug for like 3 or 4 years and I just keep reusing it. It's great. Just dunk your blade into the solution and let it soak. And while it soaks, let's get to cleaning out the saw. Having the saw on wheels is great because in my small shop, I've got to get enough room to be able to work on stuff. So I'm going to wheel it over here in the corner where I can open it up. Somebody signed me up for NASCAR. But look at all that sawdust. Yikes. So I'm going to get out the dust collector and clean up most of it. I just was really impressed at the amount of sawdust that was left inside of the saw, even when I used dust collection on it like 99% of the time. As you can see, my genius idea of using my air compressor to blow out the saw left sawdust all over the floor. Lucky for me though, I've got a Rockler dust collector with a floor sweep. So in no time flat, the floor is clean. Now that the saw blade has been soaking for about 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to use a brass bristle brush. Whew, say that 3 times fast. I could barely say it 1 time slow. I'm going to be brushing the front and the back side of the teeth, get them real nice and clean, get all that pitch off of there, and then take one last pass around to make sure all that resin's off. Dry it up. Now here's where it gets interesting with the resin remover. You can reuse it. Just pour it right back into the jug. I always spill a little bit though. To protect my fresh saw blade, I'm going to be using this blade coat. It's a aerosol can and you just spray it on. I like to get a lot on there and let it sit. And then you just come back and buff it off to a nice, pretty shine. And with that, it's time to get it back into the saw. So as I'm reinstalling my blade, let me tell you why I'm even tuning up this saw. I've noticed that I have a little bit of run out in the blade. Not much, but it's enough to notice on bigger cuts. So to fix that, I picked up this mag switch universal saw indicator. Those 2 yellow things, they're magnets, and they're switchable magnets. Of course, I'll leave links to all the products I use in the description below. So here you see those magnets in action. You just slide that lock over and it activates the magnets and it locks it right onto my miter gauge. Next, I'm going to take a magic marker and mark one of the teeth on the blade for reference. So I'm going to now put the dial indicator on that reference tooth at the back of the saw and then rotate it to the front of the saw and see just how far off we are. And it's quite a bit. So to make the adjustment that I need to get the blade square to the miter slot, I've got to loosen up 3 of the 4 bolts that hold the trunnion to the top of my cast iron top. Now the reason I didn't loosen all 4 bolts was because I want to use that 1 bolt as a pivot point. And now with a rubber mallet and a few love taps on the trunnion, and I will say it does not take much to move that trunnion a whole lot. And we're talking thousandths of an inch that you just want to be dialing in your blade. But I nailed it. Yeah, that's good. So with the blade lined up to the miter slot, now it is time to tighten up the trunnion and put the cover back on the saw and move on to the next step of tuning up this table saw. Now I'm going to move my saw back into place, get the miter slots lined up with my outfeed table, and then I'm going to lower the blade, get that out of the way, put the throat plate back on, and then I'm going to take off my auxiliary fence to get to my Vega fence. Now, the Vega fence did not come stock on the Craftsman saw. It was an aftermarket purchase, but I love it. The Vega fence attaches to the locking mechanism that rides on the front rail via these 4 Allen bolts. Now, I'm just going to loosen all 4 of them up and then get the mag switch back onto my miter gauge and true it up the exact same way that I used over on the blade. Aligning the fence took a lot longer than aligning the blade, and that's because it was super sensitive. I mean, super sensitive. Just one little tap and it would be out at the back, and then it would be out at the front again. So after a lot of checking and rechecking and checking and rechecking and tapping and retapping, it finally occurred to me that I should tighten one of the bolts and use it like a pivot point, just like I did with the trunnion. And then things got a little bit easier. I got everything trued up and it was square, and then I could tighten down all 4 of the Allen bolts and get that fence locked in and square to the miter slot. Sometimes the simplest things escape me, and then they hit me like a load of bricks. But I'm glad I got it figured out, and now my saw is completely tuned up. Now I just go in reverse order, put the fence cover back on the Vega fence. It's got 2 screws and a plate that holds it on the back. And then put my auxiliary fence on top of my Vega fence. And the reason I use this auxiliary fence is really simple. Do you see all that junk I hold on there? Yeah, I can't hold that on the Vega fence. I just needed somewhere to put my junk. So I said my saw was tuned up, but I forgot one important step. Paste wax. I love to put paste wax on top of any cast iron surface in the shop, and the table saw is no different. I like to leave a roll of steel wool inside the can of paste wax. That way it is ready to apply right there at my fingertips. So I like to apply a heavy amount to the top of the table, but don't forget your fence because that is also in contact with wood as you use your table saw. Now I'm gonna let it sit for 15 minutes. But don't worry, I'm not going to make you watch paste wax dry. That would be inhumane and cruel. So I sped time up and 15 minutes has now passed. So I'm going to come back and buff it off with a shop towel and get it real nice and pretty. The only real drawback about paste wax is, man, it stinks. With the top waxed and dried and buffed, it's time to make my first cut with the freshly tuned up saw. I'm pretty amped to see how well this thing performs now. So I just grabbed this piece of 3/4 inch plywood and I'm gonna run it through. You may not be able to tell by my facial expressions, but I'm really impressed and I'm super happy with that cut. With the blade cleaned, aligned to the miter slot, the fence aligned to the miter slot, and the top waxed, my tune-up is complete. Now I'll put my magnetic saw cover on and tuck her in for the night. She's ready to go on the next one. See you then.